Originally released in 1997 for the Nintendo 64 and later that year for Windows PCs, and developed by Iguana Entertainment and published by Acclaim Entertainment, it's Turok, the Dinosaur Hunter.
I am Turok.
What you're seeing on screen, however, is the remastered version of the game released on PC, which was handled by Night Dive Studios, with an Xbox One version planned as well for release as of this recording. Turok's roots, however, go far back before video games, originally appearing in comic book form in 1954 from Western Publishing in Dell Comics. Later on in 1993, Valiant Comics revived the series and published the first issue of their own Turok series. And at the time, publisher Acclaim bought out Valiant, and roughly a year later, Acclaim acquired Iguana Entertainment as well as part of a strategy to develop games in-house, and made some easy money licensing characters in different entertainment media. In the early stages of development, the game was originally intended to be played from the third-person perspective, taking cues from the likes of Mario 64 and Tomb Raider. However, the dev team at Iguana decided on the first-person perspective instead, to show off the 3D power at the time of the Nintendo 64. Moving on to the core game itself, you play as Tal Set, aka Turok. Following the comments loosely, the title of Turok is passed down from generation to generation to the eldest male, each of whom is tasked with protecting the barrier between Earth and the Lost World Lost Land. An evil dude known simply as the Campaigner is after the artifact known as the Chronoscepter, a weapon that was too powerful, so it was broken into different pieces to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. The Campaigner wants to use it to break the barrier between the Lost Land, and the Earth realm, to cause Jurassic Park 2 to happen. I don't know. I've never personally read the source material, but the real question is the game itself any good? Let's find out first with the good. Personally speaking, this is my first time ever playing Turok. I was more or less a PlayStation kid growing up. The only time I really even played the Nintendo 64 was at my cousin's house, and even then all we ever played was Mario 64 or GoldenEye. With that said, Turok being a fairly early pre-Half-Life shooter has plenty of good things still going for it that separate it from other classic first-person shooters on the Nintendo 64 at the time. The gameplay, for example, in Turok is much more akin to that of 3D platformers of the time, and of course each level you need to find hidden keys throughout the level itself to unlock more levels in the hub to access, and the final area and boss fight of the game. The game also has a life system as well as checkpoints, and little triangle collectible things to collect to gain more lives. As I said, this game is a very weird blend of first-person shooter and a 3D platformer, right down to the platforming, but we'll get to that later. Then on top of that, throw in a great variety of weapons to utilize, from your standard knife and pistol, some sort of machine gun, to some more sci-fi weapons later on in the game like this mini nuclear blast weapon. The boss fights are also easily another highlight of this game, from fighting a giant mechanized T-Rex to a giant bug monster. With that said though, the game doesn't feature many boss fights sadly, and for the most part, they're all fairly easy if you just strafe and shoot. You don't really need to focus on pattern recognition or anything like that to beat these bosses. Except for the bug boss, it's easily the hardest in the game, surprisingly due to the size of the room you're in, but I still managed to beat it by the skin of my teeth on my first try. Graphically speaking, for its time in 1997, despite all the fog, Turok easily showed off the capabilities of the Nintendo 64. Most notably with the large environments it boasted and the exploration and 3D platformer vibe it had going for the game, it felt completely different from any first-person shooter on the system at the time, or even on the market for that matter. But easily my favorite aesthetic touch to this game is the death animations. There's something distinctly satisfying watching a random grunt grab his neck as blood spurts out and they fall over after being shot. Considering this was also Iguana Entertainment's first game, and the first game by many of its staff, it was a pretty incredible feat to achieve. As for the newly released version by Night Dive Studios, it offers widescreen and high-definition resolutions to choose from, as well as a number of added effects to the game as well, such as dynamic lighting, bloom, FXAA, enhanced water effects, light shafts, and more, to quote the Steam page. And during my roughly 6 or so hours I spent with Turok, I didn't have any bugs or game crashes, so the game runs fine, but after almost 20 years, this is to be expected. As for the overall soundtrack, it's pretty solid and never got tiring to listen to, and it set the mood well for each level. But now let's discuss what doesn't sound so good with the bad. The biggest problem I think Turok suffers from are the levels themselves, but more specifically the length and size of the levels themselves. I feel like the developers at the time really wanted to showcase the power of the N64, so they created these massive levels to explore with plenty of secrets to find, tons of guns to use, items to collect, but these levels just dragged on and on. Especially the last few levels in the game, they just go on and on with what feels like no end in sight. So if you miss a key, for example, you'll have to go all the way back and revisit the level and play it all over again. To add to this, the checkpoints are far and few between on most levels, so if you die, you could potentially lose a ton of progress if you're not careful. The game also suffers from some wonky hit detection. Sometimes when firing at enemies, at times you'll flat out miss, or hit some inanimate object that gets in the way despite aiming right at the enemy itself. But to be fair, this is also very minor and only happened rarely during my roughly 6 or so hours I spent with Turok. Next up, the AI itself on the enemies aren't exactly much to speak of, but this was probably due to the hardware restrictions at the time. At their best, enemies will just recklessly run at you. At their worst, they'll just stand there and do nothing as they get shot. But probably the biggest offender for many people from what I've read so far is the first-person platforming. Personally, it doesn't bug me so much, as I'll admit I'm pretty adept at first-person platforming, and I didn't have too many issues with it. But I can't even begin to imagine what sort of hell this would be on a Nintendo 64 controller. Pretty much every single level in this game has platforming segments with very, very precise jumps required to get past a lot of the areas in this game. But thankfully there is usually a checkpoint or a save spot before these segments. But if you're not a fan of first-person platforming, then chances are this game won't exactly change your opinion on that. But speaking of which, now it's time I give the opinion. With everything said and done, I feel Night Dive Studios have done an incredible job bringing a classic first-person shooter to a potential new audience. It holds up well for the most part in terms of gameplay all these years later, and looks fantastic running at an HD resolution. I feel $20 USD though is a bit steep of a price. I'd say definitely pick this up on sale if you're looking for some nostalgia, or looking to experience an early first-person shooter title when the genre was still new and fresh. But now it's time for the rating. Jurassic World 2 confirmed? Starring Chris Benoit? Out of 10.